quite often the hallucinations will back up to psychosis, and then you could be walking on a hallway or something and pass somebody, and you could have a hallucination that backs up the thought. You might think they said, "Mr. President, your limo is outside." And you may go as far as to go and look and see, is the limo really there?
This is MindBody Matters with Greg Rennie and Rob Reedford.
Welcome, podcast listeners. Another edition of MBM. What do you think of that? That sounds pretty professional, doesn't it?
Yeah, but if it's the first time coming to this podcast, they're not going to know what MBM.
BM, yeah. Oh, I don't know. It sounds a bit like Mary Tyler Moore Productions, whatever that was. And I thought MBM, but then again,
there you are thinking big again.
Yeah, but then again, I don't know if it's the greatest thing to have a abbreviation that has BM in it.
Welcome back to MindBody Matters. Oh, dear. It's going to be one of those days, is it?
It could be.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Doing well.
Good. I'm looking forward to today's show. Mm-hmm. It's something I see almost every day.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in your cab that struggle with mental illness.
Yeah, not just in the cab, but I mean, just walking around my hometown here in Stratford, Ontario, Canada. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And just the other night, I saw this guy. He's a Stratford regular. I watched him, and I wasn't scared of him, but I watched him, and he's shouting out things to whoever. But and to me, not making any sense to me, but maybe he's making sense to himself. But this gentleman suffers from schizophrenia.
Yeah, Leif Gregersen is our guest today, and yeah, he struggles with schizoaffective disorder, mm-hmm. which in itself has delusion and psychosis. But yeah, I agree. I live in Toronto, and just recently there was a gentleman that I saw on the subway platform. He was very, very loud, very, very animated, and he probably was responding to a certain internal auditory hallucination, or in other words, his voices. Other people backed away from him, and yeah, I think, people are afraid of people that are unwell and have a mental illness, but they are not violent. I mean, I want to ask Leif this question because I've discussed it before with colleagues. That's
the stigma. That's the stigma.
It is that they're violent. They're not.
We'll ask Leif that very question in the interview today.
Yeah, I just want to make note, Leif had an article in CBC News Edmonton, and he talked about what a psychosis was like for him. And I think it's really enlightening, sad but enlightening, and I want to know more about his experiences. So in it, he said, "For me, psychosis has several elements. There are delusions, thoughts or ideas that somehow present themselves in my mind, like thinking I'm the King of England. Then come hallucinations, the false sensory inputs that often reinforce my delusions." And this next part kind of sounds funny, but it's not. But so he said, if someone says, "Hi, Leif, how are you?" the illness changes it, and it will seem the person instead said, "Mr. President, your limousine is outside." Amazing, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is humorous. And I when I met with Leif a little while ago, we did the pre-interview call, and what a wonderful person. We had a great chat, and he does have a sense of humor about his past experiences. Not that he sees it's funny, but he sees the humor in it. I'm really looking forward to asking him more questions about psychosis and delusions. I think that even though I've worked in mental health for a long time, I have a lot to learn. We all have a lot to learn. And hopefully, someday that the stigma is going to be reduced.
Yeah.
So I would like to introduce my guest today on MindBody Matters. Here's Leif Gregersen. As we talked on the phone, the podcast, centers around the mind and body connection, and our chat was fascinating because I saw where your story intersects with our theme about mind and body. Like, how would you define the connection between mind and body?
Well, it's a pretty fluid connection. I mean, neither can exist without the other. But I think as far as schizophrenia goes, I think it's important to understand that it's an illness. It's a physical illness. It's not something you get because you were toilet trained too early or anything like that. It's something that affects the physical properties of the brain, and there's so much research going on to actually support the idea that the body itself has a brain, like the gut has neural connections,
right?
And like schizophrenia affects very basic operations. Like there's nerve endings, and the way nerve endings send messages to the brain, like the brain is a huge bundle of nerves, and then we have nerves throughout our whole body, but they send messages to the brain through neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters sort of shoot these indicators to the next cell, and then next nerve cell, and then on and on and on to the brain, and then they go back and forth at huge rates. And schizophrenia is involved in, I'm not sure exactly if it makes too much serotonin or how it works, but it affects the neurotransmitters, and basically when you have the illness, you feel physically crappy when you're really in the worst of it, and but you get false input from all 5 of your senses. Taste, touch, hearing, smell, whatever. And this false input is sort of backed up by false ideas in your mind. And it's more physical of an illness than most people realize, because the main treatment is medication. And one thing I can recall is when I first became very ill and I had hallucinations and delusional thoughts and paranoia and all these things, I went in the hospital, and they did very little for me other than kind of just warehouse me. But I don't regret it, because they got me onto medication that was able to somehow restore the balance in my mind and stuff like that.
What is your recent diagnosis? I know that reading your books, that initially it was a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and you noticed some symptoms of schizophrenia. So, like, what is the most recent understanding?
The most recent diagnosis I received was schizoaffective disorder with anxiety, and schizoaffective is a combination of bipolar disorder, symptoms of bipolar disorder, and symptoms of schizophrenia. It's a little more rare than schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. It's still fairly common. I think 1 in 300 people are affected by it.
Yeah, I don't think many people know about schizoaffective disorder. Did your medications change once you had that diagnosis?
Well, the thing is you can have bipolar disorder with psychosis, and so the medications I was given to treat my initial diagnosis of bipolar disorder were actually pretty well covered my other symptoms too. But the problem was that they didn't really fully understand that I had both symptoms of schizophrenia and bipolar. I was very closed-mouthed about what was going on. I wouldn't talk to my doctors. I wouldn't go back and forth with them. This medication isn't working. And really the problem that arose was, I think when I left the hospital, I was probably on more medication than I needed. And that left me, initially anyways, when I initially went to the hospital, but that left me very sedated, and made it very difficult to function. And as a result, I went off the medication. So,
mm-hmm. Going through your book, Through the Withering Storm, what really hit me is your details on your experiences. And I mm-hmm. think that it'd be helpful to go over some of those stories for listeners to understand from your perspective what the illness was like, what the hospitalizations were like, because there could be people that relate to that, but also for family members listening, to understand what psychosis is and isn't, hallucinations, delusion. You grew up in St. Albert, Alberta, right?
Yeah.
And then you moved to Edmonton.
Just for a short time, then I went to Vancouver.
Right. Tell me about your early hospitalizations. Like, how old were you when you first were hospitalized?
Well, the first time was actually when I was 14.
Wow.
It was only for a couple of weeks, but it was a very difficult time because to be taken out of school and everything for 2 weeks, and being in grade 9 at 14, there was a lot of peer pressure and stuff that went on, and anything different about a person, you really get picked on and stuff. And I can recall having people say, there's something wrong with your brain, or you're crazy, or stuff like that, and being teased for it. One thing I remember the most was that after going in the hospital, I lost a lot of faith in just about everything. Like when I look at my report cards for that year, it was on a 3-semester basis, and it was like A's and B's, A's and B's. And then for the 3rd semester, I didn't even turn the report card in. It was just blank. And there were all kinds of absences and everything. And somehow I was fortunate enough to have grades high enough to go into academics in my high school, first year of high school. But I ended up failing a lot of those courses, and it ended up, I ended up deciding I had to quit cadets to focus on my school. I decided school was more important, but I was still drinking. And one of the things about the drinking was that I was constantly in a state of depression, and it seemed the only time I could alleviate my depression was by drinking. But what I didn't realize was it was kind of shooting me into these manic highs, right?
The alcohol was pushing your mood up to a mania high?
Yeah, at times. And it really drove a lot of people away from me. There's actually a couple of cases of me drinking and getting into play fights with people and getting so serious that there were 2 different occasions where I actually broke bones just play fighting when I was drinking. And but that was something I eventually did get control over. I was really reluctant to drink, but it just seemed like the only fun that was out there for me. There was one guy that I drank with quite a bit over the course of high school, and in my second year of grade 12, he died by suicide, and that was just devastating to me. And when I look back, it seems really obvious that he actually probably had bipolar disorder, because he went through these periods of just being super energized and super happy, and then we used to joke around that we were going to make a cassette tape, 105 songs to make Brad cry, because he would hear sad songs on the radio and he would just get tears about his ex-girlfriend, and but he was a wonderful human being, and then he died, and the following months were among the worst of my life, because I was working night shift at a grocery store. I was going to school all day. I was facing pressure from those 2 directions. And then there was the loss of my friend. And then there was, I was fighting with my dad a lot, who wanted me out of the house. And he was a bit of a drinker himself. And it just made it impossible for me to exist, no matter how hard I tried. And I remember, I started going into psychosis, and one of the things I started thinking I could do was make myself perfect, like be the perfect student, the perfect worker, the perfect son. But none of those things would solve my problems. I still needed money to move out. I still was fighting with my dad. So I started going into psychosis, and eventually all the pressure combined wound me up in the hospital.
Would you describe psychosis as a break with reality? Like, how would you describe that?
Definitely, that's an excellent term. Even the term schizophrenia the schizo part means split, and then phrenia is mind. A lot of people misunderstand it as a split personality, but it definitely is not any type of personality disorder. As I said, it's a physical illness. But that's what psychosis is defined as a split from reality.
Can you provide some examples, looking back, especially during your hospitalizations, that would be psychosis, and how is that different from delusion, or is it the same thing?
Well, delusion is part of psychosis. That's the delusion is more thoughts you have in your head, and then the hallucinations are false sensory input, and quite often the hallucinations will back up the psychosis. Like you might get an idea in your head that I'm the president of a big corporation, and then you could be walking on a hallway or something and pass somebody, and you could have a hallucination that backs up the thought. Like, for example, you might think they said, "Mr. President, your limo is outside," and you may go as far as to go and look and see, is the limo really there? One of the classic examples of me being in psychosis was when I was living in Vancouver. I was staying in a traveler's hostel, and so I just had one bed in a room with three other beds, and I remember I was sleeping, and I had a really bad dream, but the dream was so vivid that I was a little unsure as to whether it happened or not, and it was a violent dream, and it had to do with friends I had in cadets actually and stuff. But I got up to take a walk to clear my head, and I remember going for a walk, and I was really falling into psychosis at this time. And I had these delusional ideas that I was not in Vancouver anymore, that I was actually in a replica of Vancouver and the moon, and that it was the future, and that I was a robot with skin over metal like the Terminator. And so I had all these things going on. But somehow in the back of my mind, I understood I needed help, and I understood that this was something really bad that was going on. And so in the middle of this long walk, I kind of went to a payphone. That kind of dates me, we don't really have payphones anymore.
I remember them well, so
yeah.
I'm with you.
So I went to a payphone, and I called the police, and I didn't know what to say. So I said, "I think somebody's poisoned me and given me hallucinogenic drugs." And fortunately, the police officer that responded must have had some kind of mental health training, because he was very nice. And he was this huge guy. He was like 3 feet taller than me. And I'm sitting there telling him off, like, "Well, what do you think this is?" And he was very nice about the whole thing. And he took me to the Lionsgate Hospital in North Vancouver, where I was treated with a diagnosis of just schizophrenia. And so the hallucinating drugs part, that was the lie that sort of got me out of the stigma of having a mental illness. Like, I didn't want to admit that I had a mental illness. I didn't want anybody to know that I was having delusions and hallucinations. I was very ashamed of the whole thing. And so I lied my way into the hospital.
What was the perspective from your family? You mentioned your dad was a bit of a drinker, and I think your mom had struggles with mental illness as well, right? When you started showing signs of mental illness, what was their response? Were they supportive? Did they have stigma?
Well, it's a funny thing, because when I first had the illness, even though I had seen my mom go in the hospital several times growing up, sometimes for as long as 6 months, it just didn't dawn on me that I might have this illness too. One thing I do remember was talking to my mom about different things going on in my head and wanting to talk to a psychiatrist. And she offered to let me take one of her psychiatrist appointments, which would have been absolutely life-changing if I had taken it, because that would have sort of got me help before I really started to get very bad off. Unfortunately, I didn't want to take her appointment. I sort of thought she needed it, so I let her go ahead. But all in all, my parents were very concerned about my situation, and they wanted to help. I think they were just at a loss to know what to do to help, which is one of the reasons why I'm currently writing an article about parents of adult children with mental illnesses, and sort of giving them different advice and stuff like that. And it's something I don't like to talk about books too much, because usually when you talk about books, they don't get written. But it's something I'd actually like to try and write a full book about how you can help and support someone in your family or loved one with a mental illness.
That's so needed. I grew up with two sisters that have bipolar disorder, and I vividly remember the early days, and we're talking like late 70s, early 80s.
Yep.
Especially my mom. My dad disconnected. He was a drinker too. He was a quiet guy to begin with, but he really disconnected during this time to cope. My mom was frantic and trying to find help. So, I mean, that's definitely needed. Families need to know what resources are available. Back then, there wasn't very much, and there was a lot of fear. But the unfortunate thing is, what I understand is that family support is just as important as your therapist or your psychiatrist.
It's one of the problems with writing the book is I don't have any degrees or qualifications, and it's very difficult to write a book and to get some really accurate information out and then get it published. And I'm a little bit tired of self-publishing because it just has such a limited scope of who it gets to. But I agree, there is a huge need, because just doing research for the book, I've tried going around to different libraries and finding resources on adult children with mental illness, and there's like in a library of like 1 million books, there's like 2-3 books.
In your book, Through the Withering Storm, you use an analogy, actually a movie analogy, 12 Monkeys, as a way to explain to the average person what schizophrenia is like. And you felt that Brad Pitt's character in 12 Monkeys was a good example. Why? Like, what within that character was realistic?
Well, I just think Brad Pitt in many ways is a genius. Like he in the movie 12 Monkeys, he was organizing sort of a bit of a revolt. I don't want to reveal too much about the movie ending, but he was organizing a bit of a revolt against a zoo, and he was in. Well, there was a number of things going on. One was that Bruce Willis was from the future, and they had sent him back in time to try and find out about an illness that had wiped out the earth. And Brad Pitt, one of the first things that happened when they sent him back in time was he kind of freaked out, and they put him in a psychiatric hospital. And I really commend the way they portrayed the psychiatric hospital. It was a state hospital, and in the U.S., the state hospitals are basically free hospitals, which are nothing more than warehouses. And but Brad Pitt, just the look in his eyes, the way he would talk so fast, the way he would talk about, he said, one of the lines I really liked was, he said, well, what if they've got a computer that can anticipate everything I say and do, and they figured this out, and he was using that to explain some anomaly or whatever to his followers. And there was just so many things in that movie that related to mental illness, even the whole overarching theme of the film of being in the future and going back in time. One of the things that happened was Bruce Willis was being tracked by some kind of tracker in his filling, and he ripped it out. That is a huge thing with people with mental illnesses. They often imagine there's a microphone and a tracking device in their fillings, and they believe in, like as I did. Sometimes they get false input or whatever that makes them believe in time travel. And I just think that watching that movie will give a person a really good idea of what's going through psychosis is. And yeah. So there was many things that Brad Pitt and Bruce Willis both did that in that movie that were really brilliant.
What stood out with that part of the book, Leif, is that Brad Pitt's delusion probably was based on what they understood about computers at that time. But when you read that part of your book, you think, well, okay, Brad, his character was delusional. There's some truth to computers or the internet and algorithms actually knowing what we're doing and knowing what we like and don't like. Is there always a bit of a grain of truth in a delusion that gets exaggerated? That's
a really interesting question, because way back before the internet was popular, or I think, or even I had any knowledge of it, I had an electric typewriter. And of course, they don't even build typewriters anymore, but I had an electric typewriter to write my stories with. I would, sometimes I would sit and I would listen to the radio, and I would have delusions that the radio was saying things about me. And I'd be sitting there with the typewriter, and I'd take the ribbon out, and there wouldn't be any paper in it. And I'd be typing on it, be going whack, 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 whack on this typewriter. And I believed it was going on a teletype that the radio station people could read, and that all these people in the world could read in news and stuff like that. And then the funny thing was the internet came about.
Right.
And all of a sudden you really could do those things. And so in a way, I like to say I invented the internet. No, I'm just kidding. No, it was just the correlations of what really came true were frightening almost. But yeah, it was said that I'm not sure who said it. I think it's a psychiatrist, to help people understand what happens with schizophrenia and with delusion in general, is that it's an amplification of a benign event that creates the conflict in the mind. Like, as you mentioned earlier, there's a little part of your rational mind going, I don't think I'm quite understanding this correctly. I got to challenge my thought about the delusion. Would you agree that the delusion can come from, a grain of truth that becomes amplified? Oh, definitely. Yeah. One delusion that I remember having when I was really sick was, I believed that loonies were, the new loonies that were really new and shiny, were actually made of gold. And instead of going off and trying to cash it in at the bank for $1,000 or whatever it was, the price of gold was, I just sort of casually went to a jeweler, and I said, is it true that somebody's distributing loonies that are made of gold or something like that? And I said, no, nothing that I've heard. But yeah, I definitely agree that in the back of your mind, you almost always have some doubts. But things can be really convincing, when you see things, when you hear things, when you think things. And then, of course, there's the other aspect of the illness is that when you're seeing and hearing things that are false, you have paranoia, and which gives you just a general susceptibility to believe these things. One example was when I was very young. I don't know if my memory is false about this, but I remember when I was very young, I really liked this show, the $6 Million Man.
Oh, I loved it too, the Bionic Man.
Yeah, the Bionic Man with Steve Austin, the astronaut.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely my favorite show. And I don't remember the show very well, but I guess after his accident and his bionic implants and everything, he went to work for a secret organization. And I don't know if that was supposed to be the CIA or what, but I do remember as a kid, I had delusional thoughts that my family had been replaced with another family, and that I was being filmed through the walls and stuff like that, and those eventually went away. But yeah, it had some basically influence from things that I saw and saw happening.
I appreciate you sharing those stories, and, working with people with mental illness in my career, I know that a lot of these experiences, especially at the time, but even recalling can be very frightening. I find that there is a fear of people that have mental illness, schizophrenia. The delusions are frightening to other people, but for the person, they're very frightening. So I appreciate you sharing some examples of that in the past.
Yeah, no problem. One of the things I remember was there was a guy that sort of hung around the neighborhood I lived in, and one day I was working as a security guard at the Edmonton Art Gallery, and he happened to come in, and he had a book with him. And I stopped to talk to him, and I always knew he was a little funny, but it didn't bother me. And he opened the book, and he showed me these pictures, and they were pictures of World War II Nazi officers, like generals and stuff. Mm-hmm. And he had pasted in a picture of himself wearing this Nazi uniform.
Right.
And I remember this woman who was volunteering at the art gallery was curious about what we were looking at. She came by and she looked, and she was just like, "Oh my God," and she just had no understanding that this is a very, this is a person who would never harm anybody. This is a person who had some false beliefs and ideas. And, of course, it didn't bother me at all to talk to him, but he walked away, and her children were playing in some part of the art gallery, or her children were doing something in some part of the art gallery. And I just remember her saying, "Oh my God, I don't want him near my children."
No,
and and that it really bothered me that that somebody with an illness that has nothing to do with children or anything like that would just it's not an infectious illness. It's not any of those things.
You can't catch it.
Yeah.
No. Also, I heard that there's this misconception, and I love to talk more about myths and stigma, but there's this myth that someone that you see on the street that is struggling with schizophrenia, they're in a delusion, they might be talking to themselves. There's this fear that they're going to be violent, right? There's societal connotation that people with mental illness could lash out and be violent. But the reality, tell me if I'm wrong, my understanding, the reality is that they're more susceptible themselves to be abused and hurt.
Yeah. And I've seen that ring true a number of times. I can remember one time I was in the hospital, and one of the delusions I was having was that I had a lot of money and that I could buy a house big enough for my whole family to live together in. And there was actually a guy in the hospital who was a real estate agent. And I said to him, "So did you look into that property in Deer Ridge, which is a very ritzy part of St. Albert?" And he said, "Oh, come on, do you have $100,000 or $150,000 for a down payment?" And I just said, "Yeah," thinking I did. I mean, I honestly felt I did. I was wrong, but he actually punched me in the face and knocked out a couple of teeth.
Jeez.
And and the funny thing was he went to the nurses and said that I hit him first, and they kept encouraging him to try and charge me with a crime.
Oh, man.
And then I would have been taken to the forensics part of the hospital and kept for much longer. And had a very dark mark on my criminal abstract or whatever it was. So
let's talk about stigma. Do you believe that the stigma about mental illness can result in discrimination that's no different than any other discrimination?
I think in some ways stigma can be a little bit worse. A couple of things that really hurt were one time I was in the hospital and there was this guy that had been probably my best friend for years and years. And I called him up to tell him I was in the hospital, thinking he would be concerned, want to come and visit me, see if I needed anything, that sort of stuff. But when I told him I was in the hospital, he said, "Oh, I wish I could do that. I wish anytime I just decide I can't handle life that I could go to Alberta Hospital."
Oh, jeez.
And Alberta Hospital is not a pleasant place to go. I mean, people that are there do not want to be there. They want to be home. Yeah, but and then there was this other case where this guy was a very close friend, and we did a lot of things together. We chased girls, we went to parties, we went to nightclubs and stuff like that, and he used to work in a 7-Eleven, and after my night shift job, I would stop by and we would talk for hours. And he was also in Air Cadets, and but I ran across him on Facebook and I sent him a friend request, and he refused to answer. And then a while later, I sent another friend request and he refused to answer that. And it just, it really bothered me a lot. And I think in cases of discrimination, you don't usually get cases where a person is friends for years and then decides to blackball you. Mm-hmm. Not to say that stigma is worse than discrimination. Discrimination is a horrible thing. But it's a little more severe, I think, in some cases for people with mental illnesses. You know, definitely it's very hard to get a job if you tell a person you have a mental illness. I don't know. I can't think of specific situations, but I think probably the worst part of stigma is mental illness is so stigmatized that a lot of people either don't want to reveal or don't want to admit that they have a mental illness. Uh-huh. And if you can't reveal or admit that you have a mental illness, it's almost impossible to get treatment. And the longer you delay treatment, the worse your illness is going to get. And if you accept treatment and then get better and everything, and then you go off your medication and get ill again, you actually experience physical brain damage from being ill for long periods of time.
I read a statistic recently that out of the people in the workforce that have depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, that no matter where they're working, and I have a personal experience about the healthcare system as being even more stigmatized actually about mental health, even in the mental health hospitals. But the statistic was about the average person in the workforce, 80% of these people that have a diagnosis would not admit and disclose to their employer because of fear of losing their job, fear of judgment.
Yeah, definitely. And there's other aspects too. I mean, it can affect availability of housing. It can affect, employment, of course, and just general acceptance in the community as well. One thing I'll never forget was living in an apartment building where there were a lot of families that lived. There's some larger suites. I was in a very small suite, but there's some larger suites where families lived. And because I lived in such a small suite, I wanted to go outside and just sit in the grass and type on my laptop. Just some kid was hiding behind a curtain or whatever, and he was yelling out the window insults about me, about mental illness. And, these words really hurt. I didn't know how to respond to them. And, it's tough to deal with kids because it's not like you can punch them in the jaw or anything. You really can't. You really can't do much of anything. And you can't even insult them back because they're just kids. They don't know what they're doing. They can be cruel when they want to be, and it certainly in this situation, it greatly affected me, and ended up going inside and never going out and sitting in the grass again. And
yeah, so results in changing what you're doing because fear of their fear. You mentioned earlier about movies. I'd like to talk about something that you touched upon in one of your books, is the misconception, to say it lightly, that people with mental illness are psychopaths. And media, especially movies, do depict that, right? So the villain of the movie, very often, the lone shooter, very often the character is considered to be a psychopath, but actually they have a mental illness. So can you talk a bit about that?
Well, the thing is, being a psychopath is more of a personality disorder.
Yeah.
And, you can be born that way, or you can become a person who's a psychopath, depending on how you are. But having a psychopathic personality or whatever, it has very little to do with illnesses and very little to do with schizophrenia. when you have psychosis, they can define that as being psychotic. And I think that term kind of has a lot of really bad connotations to it, because few people actually know that the difference between psychotic and psychopath. And when you're a psychopath, you control people, you manipulate people, you strive towards power. You don't care who you step on to get where you want to go. I've known a few of them. You know, it's they're very functional. You know, they can work, they can have good families, they can have proper ordinary lives, but they're just very cruel people. And when you have a psychotic disorder or psychosis, you know, you sort of, it's very treatable by medication, for one. And it's also, you're not necessarily going to be a bad person or anything like that.
In addition to the word psychopath, let's talk about maniac. I believe that the word maniac comes from the older term for bipolar disorder. I could be wrong, but once again, just like the word psycho and psychosis, people started equating that with psychopaths. But you've had periods of mania. If you can explain to the listeners what that is and what it isn't. But do you believe that the word maniac kind of ties in with mania, and maybe that's why they changed it to bipolar disorder?
Well, you know, I suppose it does. I suppose the mania does tie into maniac in some ways. Basically, when I experienced the mania part, the high part of bipolar disorder, I was just, you know, I had limitless energy and very little control about what I wanted to say. One of the things I was doing was I had a close friend who I would call and talk to quite a bit, and I would call him, and then he'd say I'm busy or something, and then I'd just be so much on edge, wanting to talk to somebody, wanting to get my thoughts out, that I'd call him again in half an hour. And he said he wanted me to restrict the calls to just one a day, which I understood, but it was very hard to go by that. And I would call him, and then I'd call back an hour later after he said that, and I'd say, "Oh, I understand I'm only supposed to call once a day, but you know, I have this going on." But I'd be talking very fast and very animated, and it's hard to describe. You just don't seem to run out of energy, and you run off at the mouth, and yeah. But as far as maniac goes, I don't know. When I think of a maniac, I think of some of the people who drive really fast. You know,
no kidding, yeah,
in city streets, and
yeah,
and you know, just someone who has no concern for anyone's safety. It's a little different than the mania, but I can understand how things come about. There's a lot of interesting things about the origins of a lot of the words we use. Like, for example, lunatic. It actually has to do with the loon or lunar moon. And if you ask anyone, anyone who works there, emergency rooms tend to fill up on the full moon.
They do.
And nobody can explain it. It just, a lot of things happen. You know, there's fights, there's all sorts of stuff going on. And so lunatic was actually derived from the full moon, people who were affected by the full moon.
I appreciate that. I didn't even know that. I know that my co-host Rob has talked about full moons before and was asking me, and you know, because I'm a therapist, I have no idea what happens. But a very good example of the association with Luna and lunatic. With bipolar, let's talk a bit about the severity of the mania and depression and how you cope with that over the years and how that is today. Briefly explain bipolar disorders, high and low.
With bipolar disorder, I do get a lot of highs and lows. I'm really, really fortunate. I found medication that it tends to smooth out the highs and lows. And this was something that was explained to me about bipolar medication when I was younger. But I always thought that if you take away the highs and lows, you know, what good is having a good experience if you've never been low? You know, like you won't be able to take it from that. But it doesn't really work that way.
No.
It just makes you feel more comfortable in your own skin. The mood stabler makes you feel more comfortable in your own skin, and you don't get the mania, you don't get the depression. I take a medication as an antidepressant called Prozac. It was once very well known and very highly publicized, and it's an incredibly effective drug, and it has some properties of lowering my anxiety as well. One of the funny things about Prozac is I take it in the morning, and so I'll get up and I'll take it, and sometimes I'll go back to bed. And if I go back to bed after taking it, I have these wonderful, sweet dreams. They're just like candy canes and lollipops and everything. And the other medication I take is something called Depakote, and I'm on, I guess, a fairly heavy dose of it. But I'm really fortunate that it smooths out my highs and lows. There are some very unfortunate side effects. One of the side effects is that my hands shake a little bit when I'm on it. Another side effect is you have to sort of keep yourself close to a bathroom because it can cause quite bad diarrhea at times. But these are acceptable side effects when you compare it to what it's like when you're ill. I always like to say I would not take my best day being ill and trade it for my worst day being medicated.
Yeah, excellent point. Let's talk a bit about compliance, like taking your medication, and that unfortunately, because of these illnesses, often people feel that, hey, I'm feeling okay now that I'm on this medication. Therefore, if I'm feeling well, then I can go off the medication. What's your message for people based on your experience about staying on your medication?
Well, that's something I call the aspirin effect. You know, you have a headache, you take an aspirin, and then when the headache goes away, you don't keep taking aspirin. But psychiatric medication is designed so that it has to reach a certain level in your blood. And I've been taking Depakote for a long time. And about 20 years ago, maybe 22 years ago, I was taking it, and I think I was taking 4 pills a day. And what I didn't know is there's like a therapeutic range of the medication to be in, and you have to be within the therapeutic range for the medication to work. And I thought the medication was doping me up too much, so I lowered it. I cut the dose by half. And I thought, I'm still taking the medication, it's still going to work. But I was out of the therapeutic range. And so even though I was taking the medication, I got quite ill. So it's very important before making any changes to either consult with your doctor or, make sure that your doctor knows about it, or you talk to somebody like a pharmacist who can explain the needs. One of the big things that's out these days is long-acting injectable medication. And I take a long-acting injectable shot every 2 weeks for psychosis. I forget the name of it. It's an older medication, but compliance when people are on these shots is much higher. So that's something I want to say to encourage, parents of loved ones or whatever that are taking medication that have trouble staying on it, to get the long-acting injectable. The side effects are lowered. The effect is better. There was one caution, and I don't want this to scare off anyone who might take a long-acting injectable. My doctor wanted to switch me from the older medication to a newer one, and he said I would have to take it less often and it would have less side effects and work better. But for some reason, I took this medication, and for some reason, it just didn't work on my psychosis. And this can happen really with any type of medication. It can just, for some reason, just not agree with one person, their body chemistry or how they are or whatever. So I was taking my medication and getting my injections, but I became quite ill and had to go in the hospital. And that's where my book, Alert and Oriented ×3, came about.
For family, parents especially with sons and daughters that have a mental illness, what is the responsibility, or is there any responsibility on the parents' part, family's part, regarding medication and compliance, getting the person to the hospital? They take on a lot of responsibility, and in a lot of ways that's something that the person needs to, but they may not be ill. They may be ill and not not there to really understand that they need to take it or they need to go to the hospital. Like, what's your message to the families?
Well, what I've found, at least in the people I've encountered, is that the families really want to help. This is wonderful, but I think parents need to realize they're not always going to be around. And I think it's important, if you have a loved one with a mental illness, to do such things as, number one, in Canada, to get them the disability tax credit. That's one of the first things. This sounds not like it's not related, but I'm sort of leading to something. You get the disability tax credit, and then you can go to the person's bank, and you can set up something called a registered disability savings plan. And this is a really, really positive thing, because you put a certain amount of money into it each year, and the government backs it up with, like, it matches it and stuff like that, and gives you grants and stuff to top it up. And so you can help the person to save quite a bit of money towards independence. Maybe if they're a young person and they're 20, they can save up to buy a condo in their 30s and have their own home. You can use the money for anything, but it has to stay within the plan for 10 years. That's one thing that's really positive. Another thing is to set up a trust for the person for when you're no longer there to take care of them.
That's very important.
Another thing I think is really critical is for the person with the illness to be as independent as possible, to not be constantly relying on the parents. And this is something for the parents' sake and for the person's sake. For example, when the person, maybe not at 18 like I did, but maybe at 25 or something, look into getting the person into a supportive housing arrangement, like a permanent group home or something where they're comfortable living. I know in Alberta, the Schizophrenia Society has 3 buildings where they house people with schizophrenia, and they're very well supported. There's a couple things about these houses. Is number one, they have like a chef who cooks the meals. They have a nurse coming in to give medication. They have cleaning staff to clean everything but the person's room. And people really like living there, and they like living around others who have mental illnesses because there's much less stigma that way. And, everyone else living there is either trained to deal with a mental illness or has a mental illness. And so if you can get your loved one into a situation like this, it's ideal. Yeah, basically just look towards getting the person into as much independence as they can, because sadly you're not always going to be there to look out for them.
Let's talk about what families should do when there's a crisis. For example, their son or daughter or family member is in a full-blown manic. They're lashing out. They're tearing up the furniture. They're screaming and yelling. Very, very frightening. But a family member may be hesitant to call the police. I'm looking forward to not only your article, but if you're going to write a book about this, I think this is really, really important for families to understand, is when they should intervene with police.
If at all possible, I think a person should research in their area before something like this occurs. And there's always a possibility of this occurring, of a person freaking out, tearing up furniture stuff. Look into such things as crisis response teams. These are sort of agencies that sometimes collaborate with the police. I actually just wrote an article for Broadview magazine about the police and crisis response team in Alberta. They pair a mental health worker with a trained police officer, and the police officer has special training in mental health. And more they're having training in mental health at police recruit colleges or police academies, which is really positive. I remember one time I was living in a group home, and one of the guys locked himself in his room, and he was trashing his room and everything. And they actually had a police officer come down who was trained in, I guess, maybe therapeutic approaches or whatever. And like they had the big tough guys breaking his door down and getting him out, but they had a really, sensitive, kind of kind officer who talked to the rest of the people in the group home, about dealing with that sort of thing. There is a number of recommendations for what to do when your loved one may be in the middle of a crisis. One of them kind of includes, turn off other distractions, have just one person in the room at a time if you can, meet the person at eye level, speak slowly and simply and repeat yourself when needed. And I think probably one of the most important things is not to confront or argue with the delusions or hallucinations, but to speak to the emotions and behavior. Like you can just say, I understand that you feel people are trying to kill you or something like that, or that you're going to be harmed. But, just for right now, let's sit down and talk about this and see about what help we can get you to make you feel better. And that's something that's in the presentations we give for the Schizophrenia Society. I hope that helps.
In your experiences in the past regarding, in the Mental Health Act here in Canada, each country has their version of a Form 1. It could be the person's sectioned. It's a way for, often the police will use it to have mandatory hospitalization for 48 hours, 72 hours for someone. What are your thoughts about that? Do you feel that's helpful or harmful to have these legal ways that you can actually put someone into a hospital?
Yeah, I honestly do think they're helpful. Another one of the things that I think is important is to, if you have a loved one who may need to go into the hospital, to have yourself, even though they may be an age of majority, to have yourself appointed their guardian, so that not only when they go in the hospital you can talk with their doctors and nurses and get information about them, but also you can help them make decisions when they're incapacitated. As far as the certification papers go,
right,
I'm not too worried about a 48-hour notice or 48-hour hold certificate, because that's really it's really not a large amount of time just to have a couple days. What bothers me a bit is when a person can have 6-month certificates or 3-month certificates and be in the hospital for a long time, and the psychiatric team is not motivated to really help them as much because they're going to be there for a while. And I sort of fell into a situation when I was in my late 20s where I went into a hospital and I ended up having to spend 6 months there. What would have been a little more ideal would have been if I was able to switch psychiatrists to someone I felt more comfortable working with. And I think if I had been able to do that, rather than just keep getting these certificates renewed, if I'd been able to do that, I think I would have been out of the hospital a lot sooner. So, they can be good and bad, but a parent or a loved one has an important job of advocating for the person with the mental illness. It's going to be so much better for the person if someone comes in and says, okay, well, what treatment is he getting? What pills is he on? Why isn't he responding to this? And the more the staff will see that somebody cares and somebody wants to get involved and somebody, is possibly even going to hold them to account if they're not doing their job, the more of this that happens, the better the outcome, I feel.
Thank you for that. I think a lot of people will benefit from that feedback. Recently, you are now involved not only in writing. You wrote like 12 books, and I want to get to talking about your books as well. You work with the Schizophrenia Society. You are on advisory committees. You do talks. You do interviews. What is your life like now, health-wise, and also how you're giving back by talking about mental illness?
Well, as far as mental health, my life is going really good. Physical health isn't the greatest, but I find myself a little busier than I'd like to be. I sort of don't, I've had a lot of jobs, and I've done a lot of work in my life, working as a security guard and and I set up stages for a number of years and stuff like that. And in all this time, I've never really had a full-time job. Just the whole idea of working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, I like having my time for myself, and I like having my low stress periods to recharge. And I think just about anyone with a mental illness would understand that. It just can get I do get very busy these days with things to do, but I try to keep it down to one simple thing a day that I accomplish. And then I like to have my time to either read or do different things, play video games, whatever I like. And, sometimes I even just sit and listen to the news on the radio and just soak it up and sort of, one of the things I also do is I became a part of something called the Op-Ed Project. And they had a class called The Right to Change the World, where they teach you how to write opinion articles. And so I like to keep up with the news. And every time something comes up about people with mental illnesses, I like to write an article about it and send it to my local paper. And I've gotten quite a few of them published, which is kind of neat. They don't pay for them. But the idea that you're getting the word out about mental health and about the challenges people face. And I also have sort of a soft spot for people who are homeless. So I've written about that as well. Yeah, so my life is fairly busy, but it's a good variety of things that I do. Like, I might one day I might do a schizophrenia presentation, and then the next day I might be writing an article, and, the day after that, I don't really know.
What is something recently in the news that you did an op-ed piece on?
The most recent thing I didn't write an op-ed on it because I'm not sure really if the wounds are going to heal on this subject for a while. But I was reading into the situation with the I think it was in Maine.
Yes,
the man of the shooting. I think it was 18 people died. It's really, really tragic when something like this happens, and I can't imagine what the family members are going through. I can't imagine what the whole United States is going through with all the shootings and everything, and the big debate over gun legislation. I was kind of thinking I'd like to write an opinion article, sort of explaining the tragedy of the person. It was said he was treated for mental health issues. It didn't say what.
Right.
But just to write something, to sort of show the side of the person who did the killings and how he had tried to get help and different things like that. One of the recent articles I did write was there was another tragedy somewhat similar in Edmonton where 2 police officers were killed. Part of my work with the Schizophrenia Society is to go to the police recruit class and to give them a talk about mental illness. Every class that goes through gets the same talk. And so I sort of understand and empathize with the police in the difficult job they have to do.
It's a very difficult job.
Yeah. And it was such a tragedy that they were killed. And then another unfortunate thing was that the person's mother was shot as well, although she didn't have life-threatening injuries. And then the person shot themselves. And so I wrote an article about the tragedy and about how the mental health system failed this young man and failed the 2 police officers and the person's mother. And basically, so I just sort of keep an eye on what's going on and try to be a voice for people that are going to get stigmatized by news events like this. Like all they said in the recent shooting in Maine was that the person was treated for a mental health disorder, but people get very worried about mass shootings. People get very worried about those with mental health disorders, group them like that into, I can see a lot of repercussion, stigma coming out towards a lot of people as a result of these shootings.
Right. As we were talking earlier about media and movies, about psychopaths, and one thing I mentioned is lone shooter, but very often someone that has a mental illness is associated with mass shootings and things like this, but it's important to understand what was going on for the person. I really admire what you're doing now with your life, but I really admire the work that you're doing with police. When I grew up, I saw a lot of police officers coming home because of my sisters when they were struggling, especially with mania. They're doing well now, but back then, the only thing my parents could think of is calling the police. So I could see I remember the looks on the cops' faces of just not knowing what to do. And recently, I understand that they're having difficulty with these wellness checks, and I totally understand it. They're trained in a specific way for safety and their own safety. And when they're in a situation, domestic abuse too is a tough one for them. But I really, really admire the work that you're doing. You're going in, you're talking with police officers. What do you tell them to help them process a call where there's someone that's ill?
Well, I basically just tell them my own story. And sometimes I like to add in at the end that something police officers have to realize is that I'm not just telling them about mental illness because of the people they respond to, but also because there's a lot of mental illness within the police department.
Wow, I didn't even think about that.
They face alcoholism, they face depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. I know a woman who had a long career with the police, and at the end of it, she ended up being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she's in treatment right now. And they have to. I always like to say that, and this is something I feel applies to a lot of people, is police automatically buddy up. They get a partner and they work with them. But I think everybody should sort of buddy up. When I was in Air Cadets, I remember I took this summer course called Aircrew Survival. And we'd be out in the rain and we'd be marching through the bush and stuff like that. And they say, okay, well, you have to ask your buddy if his socks are dry. And no matter what he says, you put your hand in his boot to make sure his socks are dry. And if they aren't, you make sure he changes them. And so I always tell the police to check their buddy's socks and then explain it, of course. But yeah, that's something I think we all have to do. We all have to make sure that the people in our lives are doing okay. And we don't always we shouldn't always trust when they say, oh, yeah, everything's fine. We should make sure.
Most definitely. With the remainder of the time that we have, I don't want to keep you too long. Let's talk about your books. I want listeners to know about your books, what is in your memoirs versus, I believe, you've written books on poems, I believe, a number of books. What books did you want to talk about, and where can they get them?
I think the most important ones are the three books I wrote about my mental health experience. They're sort of memoirs. The first one, as you probably know, is called Through the Withering Storm.
Yeah, I read it.
That was actually the first book I ever wrote. I've written 13 or 14 books now, and self-published them. Through the Withering Storm was about my teen years living with what I thought at the time was bipolar disorder. And I actually think that was my diagnosis as well. That sort of covered right before I left for Air Cadet basic training, and then ended up when I got to a point where I just had enough of being mentally ill and wanted to accept treatment no matter what. And then my next book, Inching Back to Sane, takes over where that book leaves off. And it talks about what I like to call my long, non-linear journey towards mental health. Because I would have, I accepted my treatment, but over the course of a number of years, it seemed there was never a year where I didn't go back in the hospital for some reason, either depression or mania or something like depression or hallucinations or psychosis or anything like that. Then it sort of wraps up with me being in the hospital for 6 months when I was in my late 20s and finding the group home that gave me the help I needed and starting to write. And then my last book is about what I mentioned earlier, the change in medication that caused me to go into psychosis. that one's really a unique book because I have a lot of poems I wrote in there that from when I was in the hospital that I scanned into my computer, and I wrote commentary to go with each poem, and I wrote essays and poetry and different things, had statements from family members. And then one of the cooler things was that I actually requested and received my clinical notes from the hospital and the clinic I was at before I became ill. And I scanned those into the book as well. And
why would you do that? Like, what motivated you to do that? That's unusual.
I had read a really good book called Girl Interrupted.
Yeah,
they made a
movie of it too. Yeah.
And the movie was great. I saw the movie first actually, but then I read the book, and the author had done that. They had blended in some actual notes and stuff like that, and so I just thought that was a really cool idea. You know, it's very hard when you write something about your own mental illness to give an objective account, which is why I wanted my family members and the clinical notes in the book, because it just gives you a really accurate overview of what it's like to experience psychosis. You know, it was a little weird when I got my notes back and I started reading them. You know, they sometimes they just write whatever. They're just bored, you know. And you know, we talked about the weather and everything. And they would always put alert and oriented ×3. And so I use that as the title of the book. And what it means is you're alert and oriented to person, place, and time or something like that. Oh. And they always say patient arrived on time and dressed appropriate for the weather and things like that. So any nurse just loves the idea of the title, but a lot of people don't understand it. So
I didn't catch it either.
That's what it came about. Oh, yeah.
Oh, but, and that was noted in your clinical notes quite a bit.
Yeah. Probably the best way to get them would be to send me an email, and I'm happy to send them. I usually charge cover price plus postage, no handling, no tax, and it's usually best to get them through me because then I can sign them, and
wonderful.
I sort of have some difficulty with Amazon. If you really want to get it through Amazon, you can, of course. But what I suggest is that you order through me, and my email to contact is Leif N. Gregersen. So LEIF.N.GREGERSEN @gmail.com. And if you send me a message, I'm happy to mail the books out to you with a signature.
Leif N. Gregersen @gmail.com. I will put that in the episode notes so they can get the book directly from you.
Yeah.
And what's really cool is that you're nice enough to actually sign the book for them.
Yeah.
That's great.
A lot of people like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always say, you know, let me get a signature on that in case you ever want to pawn it when I'm famous.
You were so nice to give me copies of the two books, Through the Withering Storm, A Brief History of a Mental Illness, and also Inching Back to Sane, My Life with Mental Illness, though you gave me, which I requested, you know, the PDF copies. So can you sign the PDF copies for me? It'd be kind of difficult.
Digital signature, you can type it in for me.
Well, I was just so impressed by your books, and highly recommend people to reach out to Leif to get your copy.
One of the things I'd like to mention, I've written a couple articles on this. Back in January, my dad passed away, and I was very close
I'm sorry to hear.
As I mentioned, he was a drinker when I was younger, but he became such a wonderful person after quitting drinking, and sort of my mom passed away quite a number of years ago, and he sort of took up the role of mother and father, and he did it brilliantly. And one of the things he did was when I was in the group home, he would come down every day, pick me up, and we would go for walks in Edmonton's River Valley, which is just such a beautiful part of the city. So he was a big part of my life. One of the things I really wish that he had done, you know, he did leave me a little bit of money, nothing too significant, but a nice sum, you know, to help me put away and save for my retirement. But one of the things I really wish he had done was to write a memoir. And, you know, obviously I've written 3 memoirs. But I think everybody should write a memoir, even if they're just going to make 4 or 5 copies to give to close family members. Because I really miss the stories my dad had to tell, and I really miss the, he always used to start stories with, when I did my service time, or when I was a journeyman sign writer or whatever. And so I really wish he had written down the stories, or that I had sat down with him and recorded the stories so I could transcribe them. And I think in a way, if he had done that, he'd still be with us, And that's one of the magical things about writing and reading, is that in a way you can make people immortal. And yeah, so that's something I'm also writing about a little bit. And yeah.
Well, I think people benefit from reading about someone's journey, even if they can't directly relate to it. There's probably something in their life they relate to it. Or when it comes to mental illness, if the person hasn't been impacted themselves, they've been probably impacted in a certain degree from family members.
Yeah. Well, they say I think it's either 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people in our society will at some point in their lives be affected by mental illness.
Despite all the stuff that we talked about, the stigma, the discrimination, the association with psychopath and maniac and all that kind of stuff, is that this is the prevalence. That's the reality, that there are a lot of people that struggle, and a lot of people need to know that there is opportunities to ask for help and get help.
Yep. And something I like to emphasize is that even with the diagnosis of chronic schizophrenia, there is a lot of hope for a person, especially if they can manage to take their medications. Yeah. And, it's, of course, you have to take medications as prescribed on time. One of the things about going into a group home for me that was really good was I was getting regular meals, regular sleep, regular medication, and encouragement to get to my appointments. And so I was able to get into a schedule where, I was able to have the healing.
I'm glad you mentioned group homes. Just very briefly, in my early part of my career in mental health, I worked in outreach and with homelessness, as well as group homes. And when I first started working at the group homes and bringing people in and getting them registered for the group homes, I had my own stigma, I guess. I had my own interpretation of what a group home is, and it's not. It's not. Yeah. I think there's a lot of people should consider group home because, as exactly what you said, medications are taken regularly, they eat well, their mind and body is looked after, and it's not what we think group homes are. Yeah. I think that it's important that you mention that, and that people know that that's available, and it's not what you think.
Very true.
So lastly, I'd like to talk about a quote that you gave me, and we've been doing this at the end of a lot of the episodes recently. Is what is the person's favorite quote, and then ask them why it is and how they see the quote and how they understand the quote. This quote's from you that you gave me. The measure of a man or woman is not in what they accomplished, but in what they have overcome to accomplish what they have. Share what that means to you.
Something that may be a small thing for us, like getting outside and going to the bookstore, looking around. For somebody in a wheelchair, that can be a huge thing. And it can mean so much to them, not just to get outside and everything and to get a DATS bus, or we call it disabled adult transit here, DATS bus, and getting to the bookstore and getting inside, over the curb and inside the steps and whatever else. That can be a huge thing for them. But for other people, it can just be as simple as, I just went yesterday, I'm not going to go again today, kind of thing. But I think we can always compare things in ways to look on the positive side of our lives. Like I look at how I have to take medication for diabetes and schizophrenia and bipolar and anxiety. I look at that, And I compare it to someone who's got cancer and only has 6 months to live. And I feel really blessed that, that I'm in the healthy situation I am.
One word I see in your book is gratitude. What does gratitude mean for you? Pretty well what you said, really, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much what I said. Just gratitude, just being happy. I there's another quote that I like. A man who has one friend is a rich man.
Yeah.
And I'm really lucky that I have a lot of friends, and so I'm a very rich man in that respect.
I really appreciate your books. I was quite impressed when I read them, and like I said, I really encourage people to reach out and read these books to hear Leif's journey. I appreciate you coming on the show because we covered a lot of things that I wanted to cover, thinking about the listener and especially family. So I'm looking forward to the article. I'm looking forward to the book. I really hope that you have the book out soon, and possibly when you do complete that book, then love to have you back on the show to talk about that.
That'd be fantastic. Thanks, Greg.
Well, I really appreciate your time today, Leif, and have yourself a great day.
You too. Take care.
Well, Rob, like at the front of the show, I said that this guy's a wonderful guy, and you can tell that when he was talking. A great guy, and very grateful for having him on the show. He can tell he does a lot of talks, and how he describes what it is and what it isn't, making reference points to Girl Interrupted, making reference points to Brad Pitt in the 12 Monkeys.
Yeah.
I don't know if you seen that movie?
No, I haven't. No,
I saw it a long time ago. I'm going to watch it again because there's a lot of movies that do not depict someone with schizophrenia or bipolar all that well. So I'd be interested in seeing Brad Pitt's interpretation of that.
But you had mentioned that in movies, the villains or whatever, they're always depicted as being psycho.
Psychopath. Yeah. Psychopath or a maniac, right?
And we always talk about, okay, what's our takeaway from this week's episode? It would have to be, for me, the quote. It hit me right there in the middle of the chest.
Me too.
His quote, and this isn't a famous quote from a famous person.
No, but it sure sounds that way, yeah.
This is a quote from Leif, and he says, "The measure of a man or woman is not in what they accomplished, but in what they have overcome to accomplish what they have." I thought that was brilliant.
What have you accomplished that you relate to that?
Oh, now that's a darn good question, especially when you're caught off guard. What have I accomplished?
I interview people, and also I'm a therapist, so I come up with questions. But
what have I accomplished?
It spoke to you. It spoke to you.
Yeah.
What specifically out of it that spoke to you?
Well, just the measure of a good man or woman is not in what they accomplished, but in what they have overcome. So some of the things that I've overcome in my life, made change for me, and in a good way.
Right.
So that's what I want to point out. But in answer to your original question, I can't think of. I've accomplished a lot. I mean, just the ability to love and get along with people, and many years ago, probably I wasn't that same person. So
it makes me think, that quote makes me think that we do focus on, oh, look at that person, look what they did, and look what they've done, and et cetera. But they don't realize how difficult that may have been for that person to get there. So we do focus on people's accomplishments, but it's a very, very good point and a great quote to also focus on what they overcame to get there. I certainly relate to that. Went through what I call my lost decade, my dark days.
Yeah.
Recovering from alcoholism and struggling with bipolar disorder. Some people say, oh, well, wow, so you're a therapist. Well, that's nice that they say that, but it's something I've accomplished. It's a good fit for me, but yeah, it's kind of interesting to look at. Yeah, I did have to overcome a lot to get where I am. And you too, Rob. I mean, we're good friends. We've known each other for years.
Yeah, I was telling someone last night, I said, I don't understand why I'm alive today. Because some of the crazy stuff that I've done over the years, and I should have been dead a long time ago. And another thing that made me chuckle, and maybe we could do a feature on this on an upcoming edition of Keep Talking. He was talking about an old friend who had committed suicide, and he said he came up with he wanted to come up with 105 songs that made, I think the gentleman's name was Brad, cry. We should do an episode on crying songs down the road.
Okay, yeah, we could.
Yeah, just
sad songs.
Sad songs.
As there is a song called "Sad Songs," but
by Elton John. It was sad songs. Say so much.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh,
we'll do it. Good. I think that's a topic for down the road. But again, our thanks to Leif for being on the show today. I heard in his voice today his honesty, his great story, and what he's doing. Like, this guy's in talks. He's helping train police officers.
I know. Yeah.
And that's another thing too. Police officers these days. Years ago, police officers used to chase bank robbers and stuff, but now a lot of their job deals with dealing with mental health, and that's one of the things that Leif has offered different various police agencies in helping officers understand what mental health is all about.
Yeah, I was quite impressed with that, and impressed with the books. As I mentioned, I read his books. He sent me the PDF copies. I'd like to mention again at the end of the show, if you're interested in Leif's books, two of them that I read that are great, I really recommend, is Through the Withering Storm, A Brief History of a Mental Illness, and Inching Back to Sane, My Years with Bipolar Disorder.
Do you think he'll sign the PDF?
Yes, I asked him to. He says, well, maybe you can, type my name into it, but
that's funny.
Yeah.
Thanks, Leif, for being on the show today.
Be sure to like and follow us on all social media. And if you like what you hear, hit subscribe, download, and share with your friends. MindBody Matters is a great media production.